Oh shoot. Okay. I
There, we're
gotta
recording
look
now.
this. All right, cool. Hey, what's up guys? Glad y'all could make it. Good afternoon. All right. I'm Felipe Fernandez and I'll be doing a talk on the BEM methodology. All right. So the reason I wanted to do this talk is that like people are coding. They're doing some COVID coding. They're working on like their personal projects, their passion projects, which is really awesome. Really great to hear. And I've been getting a few questions like how do I get started, or some things to consider, or some things to watch out for. And one of the things that I feel gets overlooked is CSS, because a lot of us, we take the JavaScript very seriously, or not just the JavaScript, the coding in general, very seriously, because that's where all the functionality happens. But then like the CSS gets overlooked. And there's been plenty of cases, even at my work, where something just falls through the cracks in the CSS, and then we get this bug, and then we're trying to track where that CSS bug is. So for those of you that are just starting your web development path, just be careful with your CSS. And I'm hoping that you guys will take this BEM methodology and approach it and add it to your personal projects. So let's get started. So I'm gonna tell you guys a little story about how I started web development, or how most of us start web development. When we Google web development, or web development lessons, we start learning CSS. And one of the things they teach us is adding CSS to elements. So usually they begin a lesson by adding CSS to elements with IDs, right? So you have your IDs here, and then these are your CS, not CSS class, your ID, your, I guess, ID names. And in your CSS file, you would have your header, your main image, your title, and you would add associated CSS styling. But I'm hoping most of you realize that this is not an ideal way, because if I wanted to create another header with very similar styling, I would have to create new IDs, because IDs are unique, right? So I would have to create new IDs for these elements and repeat the styling on my CSS sheet. So of course, using IDs is not ideal. So then we learn classes. Classes are more ideal because they're reusable. So if I had a header here, a main image title and subtitle, I could create another header that's very similar and reuse those CSS stylings, right? So classes, we like classes for CSS. We like them, we use them a lot. But then you come across other problems, right? So I have two headers here, right? What if I wanted to make this title red? I want to make this the same as this, but I want to deviate a little bit from the original header. All right. So what would I call this? What would I do? How would I approach it? And these things take time just to think about, because you don't want to just have it for these two scenarios. You want to have like a global solution in case you want to make other headers that deviate slightly from the original. So an approach you could think of is changing the CSS class or the CSS styling for title, right? But if you change the styling, it's going to affect all other headers. So another thing you could do is add another class to it so that it affects just this element. But what would you call it, right? You want to call it a good name for it. And one of us, or one of the issues that we have is trying to come up for names for variables, trying to come up names for CSS classes. And that takes time because if you don't name your CSS class a good name, you're gonna regret it later on. So, and this brings me to BEM. BEM is an approach you could take for these problems. So, what is BEM? BEM is a CSS class naming convention. It's a way to approach naming your CSS classes. So what does BEM stand for? It stands for Block Element Modifier. And if I were to write it in the syntax, I would write it like in this fashion. So you have your block, and these are 2 underscores. You have your element, and then you have a dash dash, and then you have your modifier. So more on that later. So let's say you have a block. So what's a block? So you could think of a block as a self-contained component, as an independent component. So blocks are not dependent on other blocks. They're its own individual entity. So a block can contain elements, or it could contain other blocks. So now we have our element. So what's an element, right? An element cannot be independent. It must exist within a block. An element outside a block is not an element. And lastly, in this case, we have a modified element. So what's a modified element? A modified element is just an element that's been modified. So in addition to a modified element, you could also have modified blocks. So let's go back to our header example. Our header would be a block. So you could think of this as the header. And then our title would be an element. A title of a header cannot exist outside the block, because then it wouldn't be like a header title. It'll just be some random text. And then let's say this title is a red title, right? So you could think of a modified element as it's a modified element, but if this was a title, and this would be a red title. So it's still a title, but it's been modified to be red. So in addition to modified elements, you could also have modified blocks. So if this was a header and you want to have a header with a red border, you would have a modified block. So putting this into BEM syntax, we have a block underscore element. And then if you have a modified element, you would need 2 classes. You would need the block underscore element, and then you would have a block underscore element dash dash modifier. So if you were to add a red border to the header, you would have block, and then you would have block dash dash the modifier. So BEM states that every class is either represents a block, an element, or a modified element or modified block. So with the syntax, if you see this CSS class in this fashion, you would know that the CSS in this CSS name belongs to an element. If you just see it in this form, you would know that the CSS belongs to a block. And if you see it in this form, you would know that there's an element that's being modified with this CSS. So you could tell by this syntax, it's really simple what this CSS is being added onto it. If it's being added to a block, an element, or is existing block or element that's being modified. So let's say your boss is Yuan, right? Yuan says, hey, make me a banner, right? This banner is going to be the simplest but greatest banner of all time. It's going to have 2 buttons. a regular button and a red button, right? So that's our task. So we're gonna have our block, and the name of this block, we're gonna call it banner, right? Very simple. It's self-explanatory what this block is. It's gonna be a banner. So now we have our button here. So what would we name this button? What would be the CSS class? The answer would be dot banner button. Well, we could call it whatever we want, but this is, I feel, more appropriate because you could tell, well, this button could be spelled out, but in this case, I shortened it because I didn't have space. But in this syntax, if you see it on your CSS sheet, you would know that this is a button and it's an element inside the banner block. And if you see a class like this, you know that this is a block. So now we have a red button. What would be the CSS name of this red button? So this would have actually two classes. You have your banner button, which is the standard button, but then you have your banner button dash dash red, meaning that it's this element, but we modified it. So I shrunk it and moved it to the right, but it's the same design. So how would this look like in HTML? So let's have a banner and let it be a parent div. So we have our div, right? And we give it the class banner, right? It matches our design. So now we have to add a button. So let's make it a div. And what will be the class for that div? It'll be banner underscore button. So now for the red button, we have another div. And the class for that, I moved this design down so we could have more room. It would be the standard button plus the banner underscore button dash dash red. It indicates, it modifies the standard button. So really simple, BEM is really simple. And as I said at the beginning of this lecture, it's also easily overlooked. So in our styling, it's very, very simple. We have our banner, and then we have our banner button. And then lastly, we have our friend, the banner button red. So we have it as three separate classes. So one may ask, why can we nest them? Why can't we like do some CSS magic where I have the classes combined? The reason being is having it in this format, it's easily read. It's more modular like this because you don't need to nest them. You could tell just by the CSS classes themselves what this class does, where this class belongs, and what's its intention. So if you see a class like this, you know that this element is being modified. And if you see a class like this, you would know that this is an element. And if you see a class like this, you would know that this is a block. So if these classes are not next to each other, but in different parts of the CSS style sheet, you would know what each class does, what the intention of each class is. So let's say your boss, again, Yuan, he wants to make a change, right? He wants to make a red banner, a banner with a red background, right? So then we would have to change our classes. So let's make this a dash dash red, indicating that this class or this banner is going to be modified. This block this banner block is going to be modified. So we would have to add a class to here, banner, dash, dash, red. In addition, we would have to add some CSS styling here. We would have to add the class, and we would have to add its associated CSS styling. All right. So Yuan comes along and say, wait. I want these buttons to be blocks because these buttons aren't just gonna be used in the banner. These buttons are gonna be used elsewhere. So this makes sense because you could have a button in a banner, a button in a form, a button, I don't know, in a paragraph. You could have it in all other places. And because this button is reusable, you could think of it as an independent entity. So because it's an independent entity, it could be considered a block. So when you're doing coding, when you're doing web development, that's one of the things that you have to think about. Is what I'm making, is this element that I'm making, will it be better off as its own entity, as its own block, or should it be an element and live inside a block? So we have our button here. So now it's a button block. And then we have our button here that's modified to this dash dash red. So I made a mistake here because I'm supposed to add it in this fashion. Banner red. So right here, it's supposed to be dot button and then dot button red. So imagine that's there. And yeah. So then we would have to change our HTML and our CSS. So right here, it's our button. Right here, this has to be a button and then a space, a button dash dash red. So just pretend imagine there's a button class before this button red. And yeah, right here too. All right, so yeah. So I would have to add a class here. I would have to make some changes to our divs here. And I would have to add, or actually this class is correct. So I would have to add, or I have to change this CSS names. And yeah, I wouldn't have to change the styling too much, just the CSS names. So, but you come across the problem. This button, even though these buttons can be considered unique, the placement of these buttons are reliant on the block, right? So imagine having a banner and you want the buttons on the lower right, but then you have a form and you want the buttons on the lower left, right? Even though the buttons are blocks, they're unique entities, or they're independent entities. Their placements are relative to what their block is, to what block they're in, right? Because this is a scenario where there's a block that exists within another block. So the buttons are independent, but their placement is relative, or it's relative and associated to the block they're in. How would you solve this problem? The way you would solve this problem is having a button wrapper, right? So this can be considered an element. And this element only could exist within this block. So what this button wrapper could do is be in charge of placing these button blocks. So then we would have to change our HTML to have the button wrapper and have our blocks within that button wrapper. So in addition, we would have to add styling right here that places our buttons in the appropriate location. So now I'm going to continue with a demo. Before I continue with the demo, does anyone have any questions? Take like 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. I guess no one has questions. All right, cool. Time for a demo. So here I have CodePin. And let's say I want to make a header, right? We have our header here. And we give it a class of header. And let's say we have a title here. Title, right? This is our standard title. And we'll give it IESD. That's our title. And then I need a closing tag. And let's have another title inside. This is a weird header because it has 2 titles, which is not good. But title. But we're gonna do it anyway. Let's see. Let's call it IESD2. So actually, I want to make this title. Let's call it title. Let's call it small. So here we have our block, and here we have our block. Here we have our block element, and here we have our block element, but this one's going to be modified. So block element modifier. So here, let's give it a background color of, I don't know, gray. And then here, we're gonna have our header title. And let's give it a color of, what's a standard color? 333 maybe. All right, cool. And right here for a modifier, small, we're gonna have font size, let's do 18 pixels. Is that good? Did that change? Oh yeah, it did. 18 pixels, right? So you could see this is our block, this is our block element, and this is our block element, but it has a modifier to it. So if we wanted to create another header, let's say this one, let's give it a red outline. So let's call this red border. So whenever you could have dashes to in your block element modifier syntax, because we know that dash dash is a modifier and an underscore represents that this is a block and this is an element. So this is gonna have a border, 1 pixel solid red, and this should be red border. Let's make it 2 pixels. Okay, cool. So let's see. Yeah, so this is an example of how you could write your CSS. And if these classes are located anywhere else, let's say for some reason I wrote it like all the way down here, I would know that this is a block and this is a modifier. And this is the class that's going to modify this block. So I would know that I would look for a header block exists somewhere, and I would know that this is the styling that's being applied to this header block. Cool. So, um, the does anyone have any questions or anything they want me to try out?
Not me. I don't see anything in the chat either.
Cool. So actually, the last thing I want to show is how to do it in SAS. So for those of you that were in my SAS talk, this is going to be a great refresher. So I'm gonna comment this out. Actually, I'm just going to delete it. So if you're doing your personal project or your personal portfolio and you use SAS, it's gonna look great when employers look at your code because they know that this person knows how to use SAS. And if you use BEM, they're gonna know this person writes really, really clean CSS. So let's do this in SAS. So first we have our header, right? Let's see if I do this. Nope. Okay. All right. So you guys remember our good friend, the ampersand? Instead of writing header title, we could do title. Right. Actually, let me start off by giving this was a great background. Why isn't it? Oh wait, I picked the wrong one. So it's not. So remember SAS? There's two things that are called SAS and SCSS. So this is our SAS. So now, if we want to add CSS to our header title, we just have to do underscore title. And let's give it a color of, what was it? We used 333, right? So this is a format you could use to add CSS styling to these elements. So if we want to add it to some styling to our modifier, we would just nest it again. But this time, it's gonna be nested within the title. And if we want to add styling to our header, I'm gonna write it up here because it's cleaner. I'm gonna give it a border, 2 pixels, solid red. So there you go. So I showed you how to use BEM using CSS. I showed you how to use BEM using SAS, and I explained a bit about why BEM is really important, especially when you're starting off coding, because when your projects grow big and you don't use BEM, one of the issues you're going to come across is, what do I name my CSS classes? What did I name them before? And will this affect any other elements? So that's it for my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
I think it's pretty straightforward. I like that it's useful for organizing your code.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said before, one of the things that gets overlooked is how to organize your CSS. And then you have to use your Chrome developer tools. So I'm like, why is my font size 10? And then you have to track your code.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's it. I hope you guys use this methodology on your projects. And yeah, thank you
So
guys.
someone just asked if we're going to be sending this recording out. We're, I'm going to stop the recording right now, and then we're going to post it on the Slack channel after we upload it to YouTube.
Oh, you too.
Yeah.